Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to today's Visa Threat Intelligence webinar series. Today's topic will be hospitality industry threats. My name is Wenhai and I'm a member of Visa's Risk Products team, and I will be helping moderate today's event. First of all, I want to remind you that all information in this webinar is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for operational, marketing, legal, or any other advice. The speakers for today's webinar are Kevin Thompson and Glenn Jones. Glenn Jones is involved in payment system cyber intelligence for Visa. He focuses on cybersecurity threats to the Visa payment ecosystem, and Glenn has almost 20 years of experience in corporate information security, cyber investigations, digital forensics, and ethical hacking. Kevin Thompson is a threat analyst at FireEye, and he educates FireEye customers and partners on the latest cyber threats to their infrastructure. Before joining FireEye, Kevin has worked as a cyber analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., where some of his work has appeared in presidential daily briefings. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Kevin to kick off this webinar series. Kevin?
Thanks, Wenhai. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. So for the first part of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about threat intelligence, just from a pretty high level, talking about some of the trends that we're seeing. And then from there, going into some of the specifics about some of the things that we're seeing when it comes to targets targeting the hospitality industry. So for the first slide, you can see a quick background about myself. I've been with FireEye for about 4 years. And in that role, the role that I was doing as a threat analyst for FireEye was to go around and talk to different customers about the different threats targeting their organization. So the interesting thing about that is we were able to get to see from a private sector and a public sector side some of how these attackers are different, what tools they're using, what techniques they're using, and what are some of the targets and some of the groups that they're going after. So when I started working at FireEye, the discussions we were having with a lot of organizations was about what is threat intelligence, how does threat intelligence work, and the value of it. So now over the last 3 to 4 years, those discussions have sort of switched. Now the discussions, when we talk to organizations, it's more about a buyer's remorse in the threat intelligence that they have. And there's really two main reasons why we see that organizations are having a buyer's remorse with some of the threat intel that they were getting. The first problem that we saw when we started to talk to organizations is the threat intelligence that they were either buying, whether it was from a feed or whether it was from some service or from some partner of theirs. The first problem that they were having is they were focusing mainly on a tools-based intelligence, meaning that the information that they were getting was reactive about a specific tool that an attacker had used. So information about that tool and maybe a signature about that tool, or a domain that that tool is using or going to, or an IP address that that tool is using. So it's really just focusing on an individual tool that has already been seen, excuse me, and that signature about that tool. But they're missing out on who the attackers are, what some of the techniques the attackers are using when they're behind the keyboard, who's sponsoring the attackers. So if we can have a long-term understanding of what the goals are of the people paying the attackers, we can work with the organization to help them identify what information they need to protect against first. And we can also talk about things that are specific towards an industry. Are we seeing industry-specific attacks? Are we seeing location-based attacks that we see in the United States that we don't see in Europe, or attacks that we see in Canada that we don't see in Latin America? So the first buyer's remorse issue that we saw with a lot of organizations was the intelligence they were getting was very tool specific. Here's a tool that an attacker was using, and here's how you identify it. The second issue that a lot of organizations were having when it comes to threat intelligence is they were relying, or they were paying on sort of these commoditized feeds, this raw data of intelligence. They were hoping that when they get this more and more information, it'll help them identify the threats to their organization. But the problem with this raw data is, first off, it was missing the intelligence, or it was missing the threats that matter, because the intelligence that they were getting through this raw data was very broad and out of date. They were getting information about an IP address or a domain. And that IP address or that domain used by the attackers could have been used 4, 5, 6 months ago. So it wasn't relevant and it wasn't up to date for what the attackers are using currently. And the second problem was over time, it became part of the problem. So organizations that were using sort of this raw data, they had hundreds or 200 or 300 different alerts that they were looking at each day. And they were getting more and more data in. So now they were looking at 3, 4, 500 different alerts a day. And it wasn't really telling them what specific alerts matter. It was giving them sort of a threat-based approach. And here's all the possible threats that are out there instead of the ones that are highly curated or tailored to their organization. It became harder and harder to recognize in the noise what were the intelligence hits that matter. So true threat intelligence takes curated data sources that are creating high fidelity, precise alerts. So ones that are specifically targeted towards an organization. These are the vulnerabilities that would most likely hit my organization. These are the type of attackers. So moving towards more of a risk-based approach instead of a threat-based approach. And really good threat intelligence can really help you right-size the problem. So now if you have 100 alerts, but you have 3 or 4 alerts that you know are from a specific group that you know target your organization, use these types of tools, now you can prioritize your response. You know which ones you need to go after first, which ones you need to respond to first, instead of just having to go through those 100 or 200 alerts one at a time. So there was a big sort of buyer's remorse that we saw as organizations were getting a tools-based approach, and they were getting just raw data instead of what was true threat intelligence. So when we work with organizations and we talk to them about what the specific threats that they're seeing targeting their organization, there's really 3 main areas that we talk to them about. They want to know things about, first off, how are attackers getting access into their network? And then secondly, how are they keeping that access? And then lastly, why is this organization be targeting, or who's targeting my organization? And when companies are looking to purchase threat intelligence or look to build out a threat intelligence capability, these are also the 3 main questions that they should be asking. Does this intel tell me how attackers are getting access within my network, number 1? And secondly, does it tell me how attackers are maintaining access within my network? And then third, who are the groups that are actually targeting my organization? So I'll talk about each one of these when it comes to the hospitality organizations. So for the first one, when it comes to how are the attackers getting access, the 2 main ways that we see attackers get access to networks is either via web or via email. And from a web-based perspective, it's not, CNN.com is infected and anyone who goes to CNN is visiting that website is becoming infected. We're talking more of a targeted attacks where an organization outsources their HR or their IT department, and those websites have become infected. Or a conference website has been infected, and everyone who goes to that website, whether conference attendees or people are setting up the conference, are becoming infected. So they're trying to infect a specific website that specific people are going to visit that website. So when we talk about web-based attacks targeting organizations, it's more tailored towards their potential victims. And from an email perspective, what we're seeing a large number of malicious macros come into a variety of organizations. So the Word documents, Excel files that come in, and when the files are opened up, there's a pop-up that says, to see this content or to run additional content, make sure these macros are enabled. And users are clicking those macros, and then the macros are calling out and getting additional tools and additional files and running on the end users. So we've seen a really large uptick in the amount of malicious macros that have been targeting organizations within the last 6 months. And you can see some statistics about different organizations and different industries and the amount of email attacks that we're seeing. So from a retail and healthcare perspective, around 97% of the attacks that we see have some sort of email component involved with them, whether the emails have a macro involved with them or the emails are being sent with a link, and that link sends an end user out and takes advantage of some vulnerability. But in finance as well, 98% of the attacks we see have some sort of email component involved. And the interesting thing about this, of these observed phishing emails that we're seeing, around 78% of them have some sort of security theme, either targeting the IT department, the internal IT department, or they're coming from the internal IT department, or they're trying to make it look like they're coming from the internal IT department. So the 2 main ways we're seeing attackers target organizations is either a web-based attack, targeting specific websites and driving potential victims to that website, or an email attack that has a macro, or an email attack that has a link in it that's driving end users to that website. So the way that the attackers are maintaining access is also interesting and also changing in the last couple of months. So the first thing, from a FireEye perspective, we released the Mandiant M Trends report for 2015, and we saw that compromises are being detected 53% of the time. They're being detected from an external source, meaning FBI, Secret Service, investigative journalists like Brian Krebs, or security companies, customers, and banks. So these compromises, only 47% of the time, are being identified from an internal IT organization. And one of the thoughts is that companies that are relying on that tools-based approach, if that tool is not used in the compromise, then they're more likely to be identified by an external source. So around 53% of the compromise we had seen are being detected by an external source. And of all the compromised machines that we had seen in the last 2 years, and compromised in the sense that an attacker has access to that individual computer. So of all the compromised machines we had seen in the last 2 years, only around 50% of them actually had malware on there, actually had some malicious tools on the endpoint. The remaining compromised machines, the attackers were using legitimate credentials, or they're using traditional Windows admin tools or Windows command line tools. So from a tools-based approach, again, if you're using a tools-based intelligence, you're missing roughly half the compromised machines that we see on any compromised network at any one particular time. And the way that the attackers are sort of going around tools is they're looking for legitimate VPN access. We see attackers look to get the VPN access, getting around single-factor authentication, or getting around bad two-factor authentication, in the sense that a company has two-factor authentication, but you have a password and a PIN. And if you need a new PIN, you can click on a link and it'll send you a new PIN or send you a new password. Well, the attackers have access to the email accounts, and they're resetting new PINs and they're resetting new passwords. And they're able to get around that sort of bad two-factor authentication. But we've also seen instances like this where attackers are copying what the two-factor or the login and password of a VPN portal looks like, and then sending end users to these fake login screens and then taking their login and passwords. We had seen one group that was targeting organizations for sending malicious emails, and when those emails were opened, it would pop up a pop-up that would make it look like this, make it look like they were logged off their VPN, or they were logged off their Outlook access, and the end user would have to log in their user ID and password and hit submit, and it would send that to the attackers, and the attackers would use their credentials to log in and look like legitimate VPN users. The second way we see attackers getting around sort of that two-factor authentication for VPN access is organizations have the capability to offer up emergency access tokens. So, if you have a CEO or if you have an executive traveling overseas and they forgot their password, or they forgot their PIN, or they don't have the two-factor authentication available right now, you can create an emergency access token so that they can get one-time access to the VPN. But the problem, if you see on some of these here, organizations are not putting an expiration date on those emergency access tokens. So instead of saying this is good for a day or this is good for an hour, they're not putting an expiration date on there, so the attackers are able to go and either create these new emergency access token or take advantage of an emergency access token that had been created weeks or months previously and were stored in the end user's email account, and then they could use these emergency access tokens to get access to the VPN over and over and over again. So getting around that bad two-factor authentication. So using VPN and legitimate credentials is one way the attackers are maintaining access onto a network and staying hidden. The second way that we're seeing is the attackers are using sort of legitimate command and control infrastructure to send information through their tools. So historically, attackers will use command and control communication, and their malware will call out to infrastructure or server that's set up around the world. Maybe the attackers have hacked into or stolen or bought. And it made it a little bit easier to identify malicious traffic leaving a network. But in one instance, we had seen organizations, attackers set up a variety of Twitter accounts. And those Twitter accounts, they had set up a variety of different tweets underneath those individual accounts. and the accounts had set up some encoded information on them. So you look at the Twitter accounts and it just looks like, gobbledygook, or just looks like spam messages on there. But actually what this was is it was encoded information on where the malware should go next. So from a network security perspective, you're seeing an end user go to Twitter and an end user go to another website, and maybe an end user downloading a JPEG from an additional website. So they're trying to hide in this legitimate traffic. We see attackers use Twitter and Facebook and Microsoft TechNet and a variety of other legitimate websites for their malware to get instructions or get information on what to do next. So they're trying to hide in that legitimate traffic. So the way that the attackers are getting access is they're either coming in via email or they're coming in via web. And they're maintaining access via either trying to look like a legitimate user through VPN credentials, or they're trying to look like legitimate traffic by going to known websites like Twitter or Facebook, etc. And the last section, the why me section, is sort of how are attackers coming in and why are the attackers targeting specific organizations. So from a hospitality perspective, the reason why we see a lot of attackers target organizations in hospitality is because, number one, the large number of potential credit cards that are based in one specific location. You have a diverse global set of clients. A lot of times there's corporate travelers. Those corporate travelers may have a high credit limit. There's a large amount of customer data from reservations and reward systems, all likely stored in one particular place. Different businesses, so different cards, and the interconnected networks may lack some of the same security protocols. So a lot of companies are involved. You have management systems, you have different point of sale providers, and some of these ones have different point of sale systems. So you have reservation systems, you have restaurants, you have gift shops, you have a variety of different point of sale systems within one organization. And so what we see from an attacker perspective, the main type of attackers that we see targeting the hospitality industry are cybercrime actors. And from a cybercrime perspective, we do see a large number of cyber criminal attackers. You can see some of the information that we've seen from a FireEye perspective is at any one particular time we're monitoring over 100 different crimeware families, so 100 different variations of different tools the attackers are using. And in just a week's basis, we can see around 10 million different IP addresses used for command and control beacons. So you can see the total amount of attacks that we're seeing from a cybercrime perspective is overwhelming compared to the ones that we see from an espionage or from a hacktivist perspective. And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of the criminal attackers that we see are more opportunistic, smash and grab, turn the door handles, see which one of the doors are unlocked, get in and get out as fast as possible. That's the overwhelming majority of the criminals that we see. But there is a subset that is more targeted attacks. They look for specific lateral movement. They use their custom-based tools. They use very capable tools. So a smaller subset, but we do see a subset that almost acts similar to nation state, more of an advanced group from a financial perspective. And I'm sure Glenn on the Visa side will talk a little bit more about this. But the interesting thing with the change and the transition to EMV chips, in some of the underground forums that we monitor, we are seeing a rise in point-of-sale malware that go for the traditional RAM scraping. They're sort of like these attackers have an understanding that as more companies move to EMV, it's going to be harder and harder for them to scrape credit card information. So it's almost they're in a race to see as much information as they can get about traditional point-of-sale malware that's doing mag scraping and looking for track 1 and track 2 data and sort of getting as much information, as much money from those as they can before companies start to transition to EMV. So because of this, we believe that there could be an increase in targeting of some of the smaller merchants, maybe that are late to move to EMV, or maybe are delayed, or it's taking them a little bit of longer time to move towards a chip and pin process. But it's interesting to see sort of this race to get as much of the traditional point of sale malware infected onto networks before the party ends for a lot of these criminals. And so from the Mandiant perspective, we've done several major breaches in organizations that have point-of-sale malware, that we've seen sort of these point-of-sale malware attacks. And the interesting thing is around 70% of the breaches when it comes to these point-of-sale malware attacks are the compromises are coming from these remote access credentials, meaning third-party vendors or contractors. It's rarely coming from a place where an end user on the organization was being sent a malicious email that had a traditional banking Trojan. And then based on that access, the attackers moved over to the point of sale system and were able to add their tools onto the point of sale system. Around 70% of the breaches we're seeing coming from the compromise of the remote access credentials. So we took some of these case studies and wanted to see, okay, so how are these third parties getting exploited? What sort of relationship is being used in these, sort of 70% of the attacks that we see? So in two of these case studies that we looked at, one of the main ways that the attackers were exploiting this is there was a reduced authentication requirements from the third party. So maybe the third party didn't need to use two-factor authentication, or the third party was using a different portal than maybe their end users were using. There was sort of that reduced authentication or an increase in trust coming from the third party that the organization didn't have maybe as strong controls on that third party. And then also, in a couple of instances, the third party that was compromised actually had information about the victim's network within their own network. So the attackers were able to target the third party, steal that information about the targeted network's topology, their layout, and then use that to target who they were actually going after. So taking some of that information from the third party and using that to target their stated end goal that they were trying to, their end victim. And then in 5 of the cases, so a majority of the cases that we see, there's sort of that trust relationship is being exploited, meaning the attackers are either getting the credentials from the third party and logging in as that third party, or they're sending an email from that third party to the victim network trying to make it look like they're that third party. They're a vendor, or they're an organization that this company has a relationship with. So they're trying to take advantage of that, excuse me, of that trust relationship and exploit that to get access to the point of sale system. And then lastly, in a couple of cases, the organizations had outsourced their IT or outsourced their infrastructure, and the attackers had used that information about how their organization is set up and how their infrastructure is laid out, and use that information and go into their to the hospitality organization and begin to move through the point of sale system based on exploiting some of the known outsourced IT infrastructure. So some of these groups that we see that are a little bit more tailored, a little bit more specific, a little bit more advanced when it comes to cybercrime, we see them again, their motive, like a lot of other ones, profit. They're the ones going for the large credit card dumps, large scale theft. They want to sell that information as fast as possible. We do see some insider trading. But the interesting thing is their attack life cycle is very similar to some of the advanced groups that we had seen historically coming from a nation state perspective. They're using either general tools to get on or custom-based, more capable backdoors to get access to a network. They're looking to do privilege escalation, lateral movement, stealing valid credentials, and then data theft, something you would very similarly see when it comes to a nation state perspective. And there's 2 groups that I want to talk about specifically that we see targeting the hospitality industry. One of these groups we call Fin5, and this one has been pretty well known to target organizations within the hotel industry, and their particular use of malware that they use is something called raw POS, and I'm pretty sure Glenn's going to go a little bit more deeper in detail about that in a minute. But a malware scraper looking for a memory dump of point of sale system so they can get that credit card track 1, track 2 data. They'll store that data somewhere on the network and then at a later time export that data off the network and try and sell that information as soon as they can. And again, very often they get legitimate access to try and look like legitimate users on these endpoints. And one of the ways we had seen this group work is they're sending malicious emails using this Microsoft Word intruder sort of builder. So they're sending emails coming in with malicious attachments. And then once they get access to a network, they want to quickly find the point of sale system, take the credit card information, and stage that credit card information to come back at a later date and sell those credit card information onto a forum. And they use this tool, this Microsoft Word intruder. It's an off-the-shelf tool that's being sold as sort of an APT type tool. But what the attackers can do is they can upload any Word document they want and upload any piece of malware that they want. And this tool will combine those. You can see a variety of vulnerabilities that this takes advantage of. They could send these Word documents off to a variety of groups. The end users will open up, the attackers will use that as a foothold, and then they'll try and get those legitimate credentials, and then from there, they'll try and move over to the point of sale system and start stealing the credit card information, storing those, sending those off later so that they can sell them. So Fin1 group sending out malicious emails, looking for point of sale systems and selling those. The second group that we recently published information from is a group called Fin6. Now the interesting thing about this group is they were a little bit more indiscriminate. They were sending out malicious emails to almost look like spam to a variety of groups. And once they saw these end users were opening them, and these end users were in retail, or these end users were in the hospitality industry, that's when they started to drop a little bit more of their targeted tools. They started conducting recon within these organizations. They started moving laterally, looking specifically for the point of sale systems on here. They would add their sort of specific tools after they knew what organizations they had gained access to. They would begin to extract data and then cash out these cards as well. But the interesting thing about this group is similar to what we've seen in other groups. They would use more of commodity type malware to get access to a network, sort of shotgun approach it out. And then once they had access to that network, they saw, here's the hospitality ones, here's the retail ones. Now let's use our little bit more advanced tools. And in one instance, we had seen a separate group buy sort of this commodity type malware from a botnet herder, buy specifically retail or specific hospitality end users, and then drop their tools on there. So again, a little bit of plausible deniability to make it look like it's just commodity type malware on there. But once they had access, they would drop their custom-based tools and look specifically for the point of sale system. So again, this group, this Fin6 group, they were selling the information that they had seen on a lot of these criminal forums. And when we had done sort of the incident response, and when we had seen them after the fact trying selling these cards, we had linked to this group to having access to around 20 million different credit card information that they had. So theoretically, if they could sell these at $21 a piece, theoretically, a nice little profit for them. But sort of this technique that they were using gave them access to around 20 million different credit card information that they were going to sell on the different black markets. So some of the ways that we work with organizations to help them identify these things: better protection against malware, using sandboxing technology, being able to identify these files coming in via web or via email, but also making lateral movement harder. So using two-factor authentication, good two-factor authentication, unique admin passwords. And there's some certain things that we could do to make incident response easier as well. Having an incident response retainer in place with security organizations, doing good asset management, making sure you know where your endpoints, where your servers are located, having that centralized log management so you know who logged on, when they logged on, who accessed what networks, and then large-scale packet capture so you can identify, did any traffic leave, did any data leave this compromised system, or were we able to quarantine and stop the attackers from removing any data from our network because we were able to identify this because we had large-scale packet capture within our organization. So from a FireEye perspective, those are sort of a very quick, high-level overview of some of the threats that we're seeing targeting the hospitality sector. I'd like to turn it over to Glenn Jones from the Visa side to see what specifically they're seeing when it comes to from a Visa perspective. So Glenn, take it over.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. So I'm Glenn Jones with Visa. I'm involved in the cyber threat intelligence, focused on that quite a bit, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're seeing from our point of view at Visa when it comes to attacks and threats against the hotel sector in particular. So everybody knows the names of the hotels that we've read and heard about that have been breached in the last several years. I'm going to go into some detail about some of the lessons learned that we've gleaned from those breaches in terms of what the bad guys are now doing to get access to the data, what they do to cover their tracks, and what it means for breach detection as well. And I'm also going to talk more about the reasons why we think the hotels are still at high risk. And then finally, I'll talk about why we think an intelligence-led threat breach detection is the best way to prevent, detect data compromises. So, getting started with looking at some compromise trends. This is our view based upon the last 4 years looking at the merchant type. So this is by merchant category code. And what you'll see here is that while restaurants and retailers very much still at the in the lead in terms of the top targeted types of merchants and the top compromised types of merchants, lodging is also on this list as well. And although it's at the tail end of the list, it still consistently exists within the top 6 types of breached merchants, which is not insignificant at all. And the reasons behind that, and Kevin went into these in his segment, and it's no different from what Kevin stated. There's the hotel industry being the fact that it has high transaction volumes, high credit card transaction volumes, and the card holders for those cards have high credit card balances as well, many of them. So that for those reasons, we think that there's definitely a targeting of the hospitality industry. And then finally, we think one of the other reasons is that there's multiple inroads into the payment systems, and Kevin went into many of those as well. So there's multiple avenues for attack to get the intruders in and get them close to the data that they're looking for. We have seen over the years that there have been several waves of attacks against specifically the hospitality industry. The most recent one was somewhere around the 2009 timeframe, where we saw a huge uptick in hospitality industry merchants being targeted. We are currently in another wave now, in which the intruders are focused on the hospitality industry for the reasons I mentioned. They've anticipated the impact of EMV and are working very hard to extract magnetic stripe data while it still exists. And the other driver behind the lodging industry attacks is that they have formulated several different variations of attack that they are successful at leveraging, and they're essentially just repeating that formula across all of the various merchants within this segment. So talking a little bit about the nature of the compromises, at a high level, all of them take on the same sort of anatomy. The payment system breaches are, in this case, they're not the focus of the nation-state hackers. They are clever, mostly Eastern European, Russian, and that part of the world types of intruders that are focused on capturing payment data and good at hacking and definitely good at data extraction and data manipulation, and then of course the rest of the ecosystem, the other parts of the ecosystem that support the monetization of the data, the selling off of the stolen payment card data. So they're well organized, they're well funded, they are frequent and repetitive in terms of how they conduct their attacks. Like I said, they're typically organized out of Eastern Europe and that part of the world. They're always looking for easily exploitable loopholes in the security system. And so where these phases of the attack are concerned, the goal of the intruders is always to gain entry into the system, find the data that they're looking for, and then get the data out. And in some cases, it's become even more easy for them to get access. It's even easier for them to get into these systems. In fact, some are now arguing that they will always get in, and it's just a matter of when you'll be breached, not if you'll be breached. And so, in particular, looking at the monetization side of the equation, there's been some changes over the last several years that have us quite concerned at Visa. And it has to do with the notion of the cyber criminals hoarding data that they've stolen. And Kevin mentioned this briefly as well. You have the whole idea around EMV and other security strategies that are being employed to take valuable data out of the equation, take it out of the payment system. EMV does that, and in particular, the bad guys know full well what this means. Down the road, as adoption increases, they're going to have less and less access to magstripe data. So they're going to have less and less of an ability to counterfeit credit cards. And so what we've seen happening is they are conducting their compromises, they're hacking into merchants, and they're stealing data. And whereas in the past, they would then almost within a matter of weeks, and in some cases a month's time frame, they'll turn around and sell the data. And then of course the counterfeiting cycle begins after that. People purchase it, they put it onto new plastics and they start making fraudulent purchases. Well, what's happening now is the intruders are definitely getting their beachhead established and conducting intrusions, but we don't see the data materializing. And this is not across the board, but it's certainly more and more of the case when we see these merchant intrusions where the intrusion has been ongoing for a period of months and there is no fraud reported. There's no from the banking side of the equation, there is no indication through fraud reporting that anything has happened. There's no counterfeiting of credit cards. There's no selling of credit cards on cybercrime markets. And we feel that that is driven from the fact that the intruders are focused on waiting, in some cases, months, in some cases up to a year, to sort of adopt the supply and demand principle, if you will. And they realize that if there's less of this type of data down the road available, then they'll market it, they'll sell it at that point so they can maintain a high price. And so it forces us at Visa to change the way we look at compromise detection. And I'll go into more detail about that in a few slides. So looking at the profile of breached hospitality merchants, I took a look at going back over the last several years of all of the hospitality industry and hotel merchants that were compromised, looking for root causes, looking for the things that they all had in common, commonalities in terms of technology, other weaknesses that were apparent, that were, we can look at as a root cause in terms of how the data ultimately was compromised. And this is what we came up with. We found that in every case, the hotel had a single factor authenticated VPN. And as Kevin mentioned as well, this is the primary targeting that takes place with, in particular, one of the financial groups that's targeting the hospitality industry, the Fin5 group. They do target the VPN. That's not exclusive to them. There's others that perform that type of attack vector, but certainly this was the case in the compromises that I looked at. Secondly, poorly managed vendor and business partner access. So this comes down to the idea that you have business partners and other outside individuals that have access into your environment. And for a hospitality merchant, we realize this may be thousands of IT support providers and other partners, and it's a difficult proposition to maintain this. But this definitely contributed in many ways to the compromise of these historical merchants because of the fact that what happened was you had really lax monitoring around the activity that these partners were engaged in. And when they have access to all your sensitive systems, that level of monitoring is absolutely critical, because if you don't understand the connectivity and how these entities are engaging with your systems and when and where they're going in your environment, then it sort of increases the likelihood that you're going to have a compromise. And then going through the rest of the list, Active Directory domain trusts between non-cardholder data environment networks like DMZ networks, for example, and a cardholder data environment, absolutely a contributing factor and a root cause in almost all of the cases that we examined. And so what this amounts to is an intruder gets access to a system on a DMZ network or on a corporate network, really little to do with the payment environment, and in many cases not as well protected and segmented somewhat from the payment environment. They will elevate their access in that case, and what they find is that they have the accounts that they have subverted and taken over within that domain are equally applicable through trusts or the fact that there's a single Active Directory domain between the network they're on and the network that they want to get to, which is the cardholder data environment. And so it just makes the attack that much simpler from the attacker standpoint, because they then can apply their stolen credentials and their subverted credentials onto this cardholder data environment, and the Active Directory enables that for them. And then a few other things. So looking at the traffic restrictions at the network layer between the two, so firewalls and ACLs, that was almost always a factor that we uncovered as well, that you didn't have good firewall rules or ACLs segmenting traffic. Obviously, there are businesses to run, so we realized that you have to have connectivity between those two segments, but what we found was that the connectivity was wider than it should have been. So in other words, firewalls were enabling huge groups of protocols instead of the narrowly defined only the absolutely necessary groups. And so finally, ineffective incident response. And the example that I raised at the bottom there was from a very recent forensic report that we looked at that had to do with an antivirus system, a security system that was alerting on a point of sale device that there was some type of malware that had been discovered on that system. And alerts were going off, as you can see here, alerts were going off 3 days after the breach began, but no human, no process was designed to follow up on these alerts. And so what we had was a compromise that for the most part could have been prevented, but it was the process component behind the incident response that we think failed in that regard. And that just didn't happen in this one case. It happens again and again when you have environments where the technology is all that's relied upon instead of the process, and the process behind it is maybe not as mature or is not as important, and then you still have the net effect is that you have a compromise where your technology may have saved you, but ultimately at the end of the day the response was not provided, so you still had a breach. Now, looking at attack vectors, and this is in particular, we're looking at a typical hotel attack. This is not necessarily unique to the hotel industry, but we definitely see this model of attack play out within the hotel sector almost always. Again, you have VPN credentials involved in many cases. So, and as Kevin was describing, there's certain threat actor groups that are engaged in multi-phased attacks where they will target your business partners, they'll target your remote access workers just for the purposes of getting their hands on the VPN credentials. So that the beginning of the attack from the merchant standpoint is what looks like a valid login on the VPN. And then at that point, you have a process that the intrusion takes where network reconnaissance is begun and the network mapping steps of the process begin. They're trying to figure out how they can expand their access. They're trying to get the lay of the land in terms of what they have connectivity to within the network segment they're on and how they can break out of that and get into ultimately get to the payment data. And they go about this in a number of different ways. In the following phases, they'll elevate local privileges on the system, whatever system that they've initially compromised. They will then use that to identify a system that's logged into the domain under the Active Directory domain administrator account, or they'll start targeting Active Directory service accounts for essentially the same reason. Ultimately, their goal is to attack the Active Directory domain. We see this play out over and over again with all types of compromises, and certainly within the hotel sector as well. And then the following phases of the attack involve distribution of point-of-sale malware, and then, as you can imagine, the harvesting of payment card data and the exfiltration of payment card data. And if I could draw your attention to the bottom part of this, the likely targets in this type of attack and in other types of merchants, obviously the Windows domain controllers are at the top of the list, but in particular, take a look at the next ones that we have there. The SCCM systems are definitely a top target. And the reason for that is those are the systems that the legitimate network administrators use to manipulate services and manipulate different types of operations throughout the environment. So for example, in this case, when we're talking about the distribution of malware, that system, the SCCM system, is the perfect system to deploy and disseminate malware onto all of the payment terminals or the payment switches, wherever else they need to deploy their malware, wherever the data is exposed. And those are the systems that we see continually being targeted for the distribution of malware. And so those are good ones to look for example, when you're looking for the mysterious new services being launched that are unexpected. So I'll go into a little bit of detail on this, not much, but this is the basis behind why the POS RAM scraping is so rampant. We have what is, for the most part, an exposure of credit card data within a system's memory space. The malware that's written is designed to take advantage of this, and so you have, as you swipe your credit card and it goes through the hotel network, you have the decryption of, or if it's not if it wasn't encrypted at the point of sale, the decryption is unnecessary. But what you have is clear text, which means readable payment card information on the point of sale's memory. And so lo and behold, that's the exact point that the POS malware is targeting. It captures data out of memory, and it puts it off into files that are in some cases they're encoded in different ways to look as though they're innocuous. They might be encrypted in other cases, but that's essentially where the data is being gotten from, as it's being processed by the point of sale before it even leaves the merchant environment. You have the capture of the data. In terms of the type of malware that we see, there's a lot of different types of malware. There are various phases, or various families of malware, I should say, that involve sort of either commodity-based, which is something that's more commonly seen and not really open source but widely available. And then you have the privatized malware, which is the authors of the malware themselves use it for their own purposes. And we see both at play here. In particular, with the hotel and hospitality sector, the ones that I've bolded there, those are the big three. Those are the ones that we see over and over again as compromising hotel merchants. And the first one, Find POS, and it's also known as Poseidon. This is a relative of the backoff malware family. It is usually delivered via weaponized documents, via spear phishing. We see that in many cases. It's not unique to the hotel space, but it has definitely crossed that space. The next is Framework POS. This has hit retailers and has also hit the hotel and hospitality sector as well. Just as you would imagine, it scrapes memory for payment cards and encodes the data once it's done. And like I said, it does target hotels as well. The last one on the list there is probably the most important, Raw POS. This is the malware of choice for many, if not all, hotel compromises that we have seen within the last year at least. And it exists as a collection of files. And it is, and I'll show you what that looks like from the service, the Windows service perspective. But it's a collection of files that go through the process of scraping the RAM, collecting the data, protecting the data so it's unrecognizable, and then another group of files that's responsible for the movement of that data, aggregation and movement of the data throughout the merchant environment, and then ultimately the exfiltration of the data. Take a look at this slide. This is very important. This is how raw POS looks on, let's imagine that this is a point of sale device. Doesn't have to be, but what's important to remember here is that wherever you have the processing of payment data, this is what the malware looks like. It is a Windows service. It is deployed as a Windows service, and that service is called Microsoft Support. Strangely enough, it has nothing to do with support or Microsoft. And the service description is somewhat important here as well. This is directly derived from the W32 Time Windows service, which is an actual legitimate service. It is the exact same description. And in terms of looking through and trying to detect within your own environment whether you have raw POS running, this is an excellent way of going about it. Look for the launch of this service and look for this description within that service name. The description is unique somewhat because it describes, if you look at the last sentence there, it has sort of a veiled warning, if you will, that the service, if it's disabled, will take down other services that depend upon it. And it's derived from the Time service, which in fact operates that way. But in this case, this is the actual malware that's running. So I know that the actors that created this designed it in such a way that they wanted to, as a security responder or a security professional, if you're looking at this and trying to analyze what it is, and you read that this service is one in which there are dependencies, I may be less likely to turn this off because I'm afraid I'm going to break something. And that's exactly what they want you to do. So that's one great indication of raw POS. Here are some others as well. And I won't have time to go into all of these, but what you see on the left there are some of the main files that make up the raw POS data set of mostly the RAM scrapers, and there's 3 examples there of what they look like, both in file name and MD5 hash. There's a backdoor component as well, so that the intruders can maintain persistence. And then finally, you have some of the other network tools that are used both for malware dissemination, network exploration, and then finally the S-delete tool there we see a lot. And the purpose of that tool is for the intruders to clean up after themselves. And we see this in many, many cases, not just with hotels, but with other types of merchants as well. Yet at the point that the intrusion is discovered, or at the point that the actors realize that they've gathered enough data and they want to move on, they will wipe clean all traces of the attack in terms of the files that they've used and other elements and artifacts that they left behind. The S-Delete tool lets them do this. It doesn't alleviate the value of digital forensics, in which you can reconstruct when the S-Delete tool was used, but it certainly makes the incident response much more difficult in piecing together what happened. And then finally, on the right side there, this is critically important because raw POS in particular scrapes the data out of memory, as I mentioned. It stores it in dump files, and it keeps its files within directories that look like this. Look at the circled directories here. We're on the root drive in a temp folder. For some reason, the authors chose to use a naming convention that includes P2X temp followed by a dash followed by 4 or 5 digits, and those are randomly generated. But the P2X temp file or folder name rather is critically important if you're attempting to detect a point of sale intrusion with raw POS. So go look for that. Doesn't have to be in the temp folder, but certainly a system-wide search for that naming convention for folders would be a good clue that you've got a problem. And then the data files themselves are often accompanied by a DLL file extension name. But if you take a close look at it, it's almost always an XOR encrypted dump file with your credit card data that they've stolen. So here's some other warning signs. We've got some obvious ones on the left, and then more importantly, some not so obvious signs on the right. And I won't go through all of these either, but I will draw your attention to one in particular. Looking at the not so obvious sign right about in the middle there, look for the PS Tools set of tools. This is a sysinternals. It's a legitimate network and host set of networking tools. A lot of environments have these. They are used by the network administrators and other folks to troubleshoot and perform network activities. Well, they're also used by these threat actors that are involved in payment card data theft. And in the case of the hotel compromises that I looked through and I examined, it was a component in every single one of them. And so the question would be, if I'm looking for signs of trouble, and I expect the use of PS tools. In other words, if I'm a network administrator and I know that my group uses the various PS tools to conduct their work, well, then that may not be a red flag. But if they don't, then that is almost certainly a red flag. This is a set of tools that the intruders bring with them and use to, like I said, to disseminate their malware, to perform network reconnaissance, all sorts of things. So that's a telltale sign right there that you've got a problem. So that's definitely something to look for. And then finally, we have partnered with FireEye, and we're talking about threat intelligence, and we've partnered with FireEye to launch an intel service. It's called Visa Threat Intelligence. It incorporates a lot of the information that you heard from Kevin and from me about indicators of compromise, and all of the information that FireEye knows about financial threat actors like the Fin5 group that Kevin mentioned, and a lot of the other elements of the types of attacks and the attacks that we see in the payment ecosystem, some of which that I've mentioned as well. And so we partnered with FireEye to essentially combine this intelligence into one place. And we have what amounts to information on detailed attacks about data compromises, not just within the payment space, although we're centered towards that, but other types of cybercrime as well. We have intelligence on who's behind the attacks and the businesses being targeted by cyber criminals, the methodologies and the methods that they use, and looking at what the threat intel service is made up of. It's really 3 components. It's the briefings, which are curated and detailed. These are finished intelligence products. They're designed to be human digestible. They're readable. A lot of the information that Kevin showed you those are good examples of the type of information that exists in a briefing format, where you're going to have the TTPs, the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that the bad guys are are adopting, the threat groups behind them, the types of entities that they target, how they go about their targeting, and how they go about their attacks. Secondly, we have indicator feeds, and those are really critical from both the FireEye and the Visa standpoint. And what you can expect here is that it's all that FireEye has in their knowledge base of attacks, in the describing the indicators of compromise, the attack characteristics like IP addresses, fully qualified domain names, malware characteristics, malware identifiable MD5 hashes, things like that, and command and control infrastructure. Well, that FireEye piece is huge, and it is definitely a huge component, and it is has a huge impact on breach identification. And so the other piece to that is Visa feeds. We have lots of information, as you would imagine, on payment data compromises spanning a great amount of time, and we are making that available now in one place. So what you can expect is that all that we have amassed in terms of knowledge about how hotels are victimized, hotels and other merchants in particular, all of the relevant information about the attack, the tactics used, the tools, anything about the sources of the attack, they're all available now to be digestible either automatically or manually. And this is all in one place. And then finally, Community Circles, which is an intel sharing part of the platform, which enables the secure sharing of intelligence as opposed to over email and other mechanisms, less secure. This is the platform that will support different types of merchants or groups of merchants sharing intelligence amongst themselves, so that they can hope to affect detection, and they can compare notes and share intel. And so that's what we've got with Visa Threat Intelligence. And then finally, a case study, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. As I said, we've got all of this intelligence living in one place. So this is a case study that we have from last year. It is a merchant that we have provided intel information for, and in a quick synopsis, we gathered early in the year some intel from a malware infection that impacted a restaurant rather, and we disseminated the information to another set of restaurants. And we thought at the time that that group of restaurants was highly likely to be targeted, so we disseminated a set of indicators of compromise to them, and one of those restaurants plugged the indicators into their system, and lo and behold, they were able to detect their compromise. It had been going on for a period of weeks, but in that case, what's important to point out is that there were no other indications that that merchant has been breached. There was no fraud reported. There was there were no common points of purchase. There were no other indicators that the compromise was going on. And this was a success story for the same mechanism that Visa Threat Intelligence uses to detect compromise. So for now, I think, and we're almost at the time, so I will hand it back to Wenhai for this slide. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Glenn and Kevin. We hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. A few last points to wrap things up. And if you have any questions about Visa Threat Intelligence, if you want to see a demo, feel free to email us at visathreatintelligence@visa.com. So thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good day.